Detroit was built to move things: cars, steel, money, people. And during Prohibition, one more thing moved through this city faster than almost anyone could stop: liquor. Across the river, Canada stayed wet. On this side, America pretended to stay dry. That lie made Detroit one of the richest criminal cities in the country. And in the shadows of that river, a gang rose so fast, so violently, and so completely that for a time it seemed the city itself belonged to them. This is the story of Detroit's Purple Gang. Detroit did not just smuggle liquor. It industrialized risk. By the 1920s, Detroit was booming. Factories roared, workers filled the streets, and the river connected the city to another world just across the water. It looked like a city of industry. But once Prohibition began, that same city became something else: a gateway for illegal liquor, fast money, and organized violence. Detroit had one advantage few American cities could match. Canada was just across the river, and liquor was still available there. That turned the Detroit River into one of the most valuable smuggling routes in America. Every crossing meant money. Every crate meant risk, and every successful run made criminals bolder. The trade was simple in theory. Liquor came across the river. Trucks and cars moved it through the city. Speakeasies sold it in secret. But simple trades become wars when too many men want the same river, the same streets, and the same profits. Detroit was not just drinking illegally. It was building an underworld economy. The river was a border by law and a highway by night. All across Detroit, illegal bars, often called blind pigs, opened in basements, back rooms, and hidden corners of ordinary buildings. They gave the city what the law tried to ban. But every drink poured in those rooms depended on smugglers, corrupt protection, and gangs willing to use force to keep the flow alive. Out of Detroit's Lower East Side came a group that would soon become legendary. They were young, reckless, ambitious, and deeply familiar with the city's rough streets. Over time, they became known as the Purple Gang, and unlike older crime groups, they rose in the exact moment when illegal alcohol made violence profitable on an industrial scale. At first, they were not the biggest players. They hijacked liquor from others, leaned on weaker operators, and learned quickly. But Prohibition rewarded aggression. The more ruthless the gang, the faster it could grow. Detroit was full of smugglers. The Purple Gang became feared because they were willing to rob smugglers too. The Purple Gang did not wait for power, it stole it. That was their real advantage. They did not need to produce the liquor, they simply took it. Hijacking became one of their core weapons. If another crew moved whiskey through Detroit, the Purple Gang could intercept it, seize it, and resell it. In a city already built on illegal trade, they turned predation into business strategy. Like every major underworld empire, this one depended on more than guns. It depended on silence, fear, and corruption. When enough money moves through a city, some people stop asking questions. Others start taking payments. That did not mean every official was compromised. It meant the gangs only needed enough weakness to keep operating. By the late 1920s, the Purple Gang was no longer a street crew. It had become one of the most dangerous criminal forces in Detroit. The gang's name spread through gambling rooms, liquor networks, labor disputes, and whispered threats. Witnesses were frightened, rivals were cautious, and the city learned that some gangsters no longer acted like thugs. They acted like managers. Every crate of whiskey made the next murder easier to fund. Detroit did not operate alone. Its liquor routes mattered far beyond Michigan. Connections stretched toward Chicago and deeper into the national underworld. That made Detroit valuable and dangerous. Once a city becomes part of a larger criminal map, local violence starts serving national money. The Purple Gang benefited from that position while it lasted. Bootlegging made them rich, but liquor was never enough. Like many rising gangs, they spread into extortion, labor pressure, gambling, and intimidation. One of the most notorious examples was the conflict known as the Cleaners and Dyers War, where criminal force and labor power mixed into a brutal struggle for control and payments. This was the phase when Detroit's underworld stopped looking like a hidden vice scene and started looking like open coercion. Violence was no longer only about gang rivalries. It was now aimed at businesses, workers, and anyone who resisted. The gang's message was simple. In some parts of Detroit, the price of doing business was obedience. Around their peak, the Purple Gang seemed nearly untouchable. They were tied to liquor, gambling, drugs, hijacking, and intimidation. People feared testifying against them. Rivals had to calculate every move. For a time, it felt as if the gang had found the perfect formula: river money, city fear, and a reputation violent enough to protect both. But criminal empires often fail the moment they begin to enjoy themselves. Money changes behavior. Successful gangsters become suspicious, proud, and harder to control. The more the Purple Gang grew, the more dangerous its inner tensions became. What once looked like a united force slowly started turning inward. The gang's greatest weapon was not alcohol, it was fear. No empire collapses without warning. In Detroit, the warning came as rumor. Men were suspected of skimming money, crossing the wrong people, or making private deals. Distrust spread faster than proof. In gangs built on fear, that is enough. Once loyalty becomes uncertain, every conversation starts to sound like a trap. In 1931, 3 men connected to the underworld were invited to what looked like a peace meeting at Detroit's Collingwood Manor apartments. It was presented as a chance to settle tensions. In that world, peace meetings often meant the opposite. Men attended because refusing could be just as dangerous as arriving. When the men arrived, they did not find peace. They found an execution. The killings became infamous and entered Detroit history as the Collingwood Manor Massacre. More than a brutal hit, it was a turning point. The violence was so blatant and so internal that it signaled something had changed inside the Purple Gang itself. Collingwood was not just a massacre. It was a public crack in a private empire. The massacre did not just shock the city. It cracked the myth of invincibility. Once a gang starts murdering within its own orbit so openly, law enforcement gains pressure, witnesses become more vulnerable, and rivals sense weakness. Collingwood was not the beginning of Detroit's mob violence. It was the moment the Purple Gang's decline became visible. For years, witnesses had been too terrified to talk. But after Collingwood, pressure increased. Investigators had a clearer target. The gang was no longer simply feared, it was exposed. That did not make the city safe overnight. It did mean the Purple Gang could no longer hide behind the illusion that nobody would ever testify against them. Trials and convictions followed. The legal process was imperfect, slow, and often frustrating. But the larger outcome mattered. The Purple Gang's leadership aura was breaking. Prison, internal war, and lost momentum did what rival gangs had struggled to do. They weakened a criminal empire that had once looked untouchable. The fall was not one dramatic final night. It was slower than that. Some members were jailed, others were killed, others faded into smaller roles. By the mid-1930s, the Purple Gang no longer ruled Detroit the way it once had. The city had not defeated organized crime. It had only watched one style of organized crime collapse. Prohibition ended, but the underworld had already learned how to survive. And that is the part many cities learn too late. When one violent empire falls, a quieter one may already be prepared to inherit the business. In Detroit, older and more structured criminal networks were ready to benefit from the chaos the Purple Gang left behind. The flashy river wars faded. The system remained. The next phase of Detroit organized crime was less theatrical and often more disciplined. That is what happens when underworld power matures. Open hijacking gives way to steadier rackets. Loud street violence gives way to controlled influence. Detroit's criminal world was evolving from chaotic prohibition brutality into something colder and more durable. When Prohibition ended, some Americans hoped the gangster era would collapse with it. But criminal money does not disappear just because one product becomes legal again. By then, the networks, habits, and corruption patterns were already built. Detroit's underworld simply adapted. The river had trained the city's mob economy too well. Liquor had been the great accelerant. After that came steadier businesses, gambling, extortion, labor influence, and vice. The names changed, the methods became more polished, but the lesson remained the same. Once organized crime learns how to operate like an institution, it does not need one single commodity to survive. By the late 1930s, Detroit was still a working city, still a manufacturing giant, still a place of motion and ambition. But it had also been changed by the years when criminal organizations used the river, the streets, and the city's rapid growth to build private power. That kind of change does not leave with one gang. Detroit's mob story did not end when one gang fell. It simply changed style. Even when the boats became less central, the river remained a symbol of the era that transformed Detroit. It had carried cargo, fortunes, danger, and death. It made young criminals powerful. It made the city vulnerable. And long after the wildest years had ended, the Detroit River still represented the rot that had fed an empire. People remembered the headlines, the raids, the killings, the names, and the silence. They remembered how witnesses hesitated and how businesses bent under pressure. The Purple Gang became legend partly because it was real and partly because it showed how quickly a modern American city could be bent by organized violence when the money was large enough. The lie was simple. America said the nation was dry. Detroit knew better. That contradiction created a market, and the market created predators. The Purple Gang did not invent greed, corruption, or violence. They simply mastered the opening that Prohibition gave them, and for a few years they mastered it better than almost anyone else. In the end, Detroit survived the gang that once seemed larger than the city itself. But survival is not the same as innocence. The Purple Gang left behind more than headlines. It left a blueprint of what criminal power could look like in a border city full of movement, money, and weak points. And once a city learns that lesson, it never fully forgets it.